patient. We had a great panel in here before of ladies talking about plus-size cosplay, and I didn't want to hurry them up because they were just being so good and so awesome. But what I have now, as I was just saying to my friend, is we have a very, very focused panel with a lot of material, although not nearly as much material as I could have given you. But I have a lot of slides, so you're going to have to really concentrate. I was going to say there will be a test at the end to make you concentrate, but that wouldn't be fair because that would be lying. And we don't want to do that because we're friends. But what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how Japan views Britain through anime and manga, and why. And that's why it's Rule Brittanima and not Rule Britannia. Because we all see the world in ways that are defined by our upbringing, by our education, but most importantly, by our expectations. We see the world we expect. And that's why a distorting mirror like this sculpture in Chicago's Millennium Park is really unsettling. You know when you go into a fairground hall of mirrors in an old-fashioned place? It's weird. You laugh, but it's weird. There's something about it that throws you off center because it shows you yourself in a way that doesn't conform to your expectations. And by the way, this is a British artwork by our sculptor Sir Anish Kapoor. It's called Cloud Gate, and it's beautiful in Chicago. I've stood under it and looked at it and thought, this is astonishing. But when we see ourselves through a distorting mirror, we see things that perhaps we'd rather not see, perhaps we've never seen before. Because you guys think you know my country, right? Yeah? And so do our Japanese friends. Britain is history, Britain is culture, Britain is music, Britain is art, Britain is tea, Britain is a very well-respected monarch that everybody loves. Is this sounding like Japan yet? I think it might. Oh, incidentally, I want to give you a fun fact about Her Majesty the Queen, who is an awesome woman and absolutely rocks. Did you know that Her Majesty the Queen is not only the last surviving monarch who served in her nation's armed forces during World War II, but she is also the only surviving monarch, and as far as I know, the only monarch who can strip down and reassemble the engine of a Jeep. That's come in really handy in the wilds of Scotland a few times, I can tell you. So our Queen is awesome. My country is awesome. I love Britain, and I hope you're all going to come and visit me there someday. Preferably not all on the same day, because I don't have that many cups. And in Britain, the most disgraceful thing you can do to a visitor is not offer them tea. So if you are all going to come on the same day, please call ahead so that I can borrow some. But let's have a little look at what we've got in common. And when you think about all the things I mentioned before, history, culture, monarchy, and so on, it's not surprising that British logos are very popular. I mean, that character on the far right, Karen Kujo, her Union Jack Parker, is really striking a chord with kids in Japan because the parka's innately cool anyway. The parka is a cool garment because it references both the 60s and the 90s, so pop and Britpop. And when you stick a Union Jack on it as well, it kind of screams, look how cool I am, I rock. Obviously, all those references are summed up in these brief visual clues, but there's a lot more to it than that. The great American scholar, Frederick L. Choate, wrote a book called America and the Four Japans. Anybody here read it? I thoroughly recommend it to you, because if you're interested in how we relate to each other, to all the other countries in this world, it'll be very, very interesting. Its subtitle lists the four Japans that America perceives and that America's had to come to terms with. Japan as friend, Japan as foe, Japan as model, role model for America, and Japan as mirror. And breaking things down into those terms, into how does another country see us? It's a really useful way of understanding a culture's reactions by evaluating how it perceives another culture, and also how those perceptions change over time. Because for a while, Japan was America's friend when it opened up the country in the 1850s and 60s. Then it was America's foe during World War II. Now it's America's friend again, providing bases for nuclear subs, being a loyal supporter in the United Nations. So Japan and America, their relationship has swung from one pole to the other and back again over time. So how does Japan see Britain? I kind of tag them in these ways. They're reflected in anime as a mirror, Britain as a mirror of Japan, as Britain as a metaphor for Japan, Britain as a mashup of Japan, Britain as a puzzle that Japan has to solve, and of course, for the ultimate tourist, Britain as a playground for Japan. And we'll look at each in a bit more detail, but first, I want to get rid of the elephant that always lurks in the room when we talk about my country's influence on Japanese TV. Now, does anyone know what that elephant might be? Clue? It's big, it's green, it's got wings. Thunderbirds. The Jerry Anderson 1960s TV series gave Japan the Sentai show, gave Japan the cool British blonde, and there's a whole series of conversations that we could have on the influence of Jerry and Sylvia Anderson's TVSF puppet extravaganza on Japan, but they're not relevant to this argument. And that's largely because, although the show was made in Britain and featured in Lady Penelope Creighton-Ward, one of the hottest British action heroines ever, it was about a family of Americans who lived on an island in the Pacific. Now, if you get the con to ask me back next year, maybe we can talk about Thunderbirds and its influence on Japan. But Thunderbirds and its influence on how Japan perceives Britain, a non-starter. So how is Britain Japan's mirror, and how is that helpful in understanding and exploring anime and manga? Well, as we said, a mirror lets you look at things that appear familiar, but are actually back to front. Any of you who are artists might have had that experience where you take your work and you hold it up in front of a mirror, and that immediately, by reversing it, making you look from an unfamiliar angle, it lets you see any problems with your work, and you think, oh my God, that line's out, I've got that wrong, I need to correct that. A mirror is a really useful tool. There's a movie called Doppelganger, known in America's Journey to the Far Side of the Sun, which is about an Earth probe from an identical Earth hidden behind the sun that arrives in this world, and how its people, the people of that craft, perceive the world as literally back to front. A mirror is really handy for showing you things about your own society that you haven't noticed because you're so familiar with it. So Japan uses Britain to explore ideas about itself at a safe distance. And I mean, look at our similarities. Japan is Britain's natural mirror. We have ancient monarchies. We both have ancient empires. Our queen and their emperor have been around the block a few times, but they are tough old birds who know what they're doing. We both have cherished beliefs that nobody really actually believes in, but everybody absolutely knows are true. Japanese people, rational Japanese friends of mine tell me, of course I know that we're not really descended from the sun goddess, but the emperor is absolutely descended in unbroken line from the sun goddess. This happens. The emperor isn't a god, it's just a fact that we're descended from Amaterasu. It's not something open for debate. And we've also got, in both countries, extremely ancient buildings, extremely ancient art, and wonderful customs. Our places of worship are maintained and revered, even though very few people actually worship there outside the great festivals, and most people visit both British churches and Japanese shrines as tourists, not pilgrims. Tea. We both share tea. Different style of making, same reverence for the ritual. Best crockery, warm the pot, guests serve first, dinky little sweet cakes and biscuits. We both do tea in broadly the same way. It's just that you would never put milk in matcha, and this is very wise because it tastes disgusting. And we also have funky clerics in exotic outfits in both Britain and Japan, and some of them are actually female in both countries. But when we look at how Britain sometimes appears in anime, I wonder if we're looking at the same country, because there's a kind of time warp effect, mixing up ideas from Britain's past with Japan's present and producing some amazing anime and manga. For example, Code Geass Lelouch the Rebellion. The Britannian Empire doesn't even include Britain. In fact, the rebellion has its Britannian Empire centered on America. That's right, guys. Far as Clamp is concerned, your revolution went in the wrong direction. You should have kept the monarchy and taken over the empire. And Britain, meanwhile, in Clampverse, is in Europe. Well, nobody's right all the time. But let's have a look at the old school tie. Now, I don't know how many of you know Twins at St. Clair's, Futagi no Achame. First written in 1941 by the great Enid Blyton, who remains one of Britain's most influential children's authors, with all her books still in print more than 50 years after her death. Twins at St. Clair's is the story of two mischievous twin girls who are sent to boarding school by their parents. And it's all very British and very jolly hockey sticks. Now, 1941. In 1991, 50 years later, it was animated by Tokyo Movie Shinsha with a little bit of updating, but not really so much. Ochami na Futago, Claire Gakuin Monogatari. The Mischievous Twins, story of the girls at St. Clair's High School. It's been shown since it was animated in Portugal, Italy, Germany, Austria, France, Spain, Latin America, the Philippines, and to my absolute astonishment, Kurdistan, and right across the Arab world. This is the TMS Kurdish promo sheet for a program made in Japan about girls at a British wartime school. Think of other anime set in exclusive private schools, and you'll see that there are lots of them. Harry Potter is not the only private school influence, even though he's the most recent. Japan has been looking at British private schools and being inspired by them for a long time. And one reason that anime and manga love the private schools so much is British writers like Enid Blyton. Other anime based on British novels range from very little known ones. Five Children and It by E. Nesbitt became Onegai Samiad, a story about five kids who find an ancient magical creature buried in the sand dunes when they're on holiday and get it to grant them wishes. And again, that is a story that's sold all over the world in animated form. And then we get hugely popular stories like Agatha Christie's great detectives Poirot and Marple, 39 half-hour episodes on Japan's national broadcaster NHK from July 2004 to May 2005. Studio Ghibli, of course, are very fond of British novels. They use them as influences for whole novels, like The Borrowers on Arrietty, like When Marnie Was There, filmed as it was, like parts of stories. Roald Dahl, for example, has part of one of his stories used as an inspiration for Porco Rosso. There's even a hidden British influence in Princess Mononoke. I've actually got another presentation about that, but we'll come back to that later. But some Japanese artifacts play really funky games with Britishness. And by Britishness, many of them mean Englishness. But Hellsing goes right into Britishness. It recognizes, the manga recognizes many aspects of Britishness that are frankly too horrid for Japan. Girls' schools are cute. The internecine war between the Church of England and the Catholic faith that led to the IRA bombings of Britain and is still being fought in many ways is too grungy for most studios, but not for Hellsing. They tackle it face on. But in some regards, the anime takes artistic license as far as it'll go. Tower of London? Anyone been to the Tower of London? Did it look like that? Really? Hellsing is really loosely based on Dracula, which is a novel and a play by the Anglo-Irish author Bram Stoker, but it's evident that the production team was, how shall we say, not overly hidebound in its approach to the source material, because this is what the Tower of London actually looks like. If you look at the gloomy, penumbrous Hellsing mansion, how different from the residence of our own dear Queen at Buckingham Palace. And if you look at their image of a castle in Scotland, although it can be grim up north, the sun does shine even on Scotland. Here's the Castle of May and the Castle of Ochil, but although Helsinki is not really good at showing how Britain actually looks, although again, a lot of Japanese people I meet who are Helsing fans are quite surprised to find we don't look like that, it's good at suggesting that the society underpinning its world is rotten, that loyalty and devotion to tradition and an ancient monarchy can be misplaced and counterproductive. And one of my favorite things about Helsing, it tells us that being a powerful woman in a patriarchal hierarchy comes at a price. Now, if you're making those observations about politics and society, it pays not to cite them too close to home. So setting Helsing in Britain let Hirano-san in the manga and the producers of the anime say things about Japan that they couldn't have said if they'd set it in Japan, although they do mangle the Celtic language, something horrid. Bobansi, excuse me, what is a bobansi? They actually meant Bobanshi, which is one of the great Gaelic horror creatures. I'd say ghosts, but they're not necessarily ghosts. So we can see the uses of anime as a mirror, but what about its uses as a metaphor? Well, there are a lot of shades between mirror and metaphor, but I think we can take strongly metaphoric things. And staying with Helsing, the show's main aim is to show Britain as a place that's darker and more hidebound and less safe than Japan, so that you can enact all these things that could never possibly happen in Japan. No, 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 no. It's just that we happen to have this crumbling society, archaic politics, old monarchy. Britain is a place where things like vampires might exist. Britain is a place where a monarchy or corrupt politician might make use of monsters for their own ends. In other words, it's a metaphor. But for what? Now, you and I might choose to see this as a metaphor of the dangers of the polarization of Japanese politics between left and right, between, let's say, the remilitarizers and the demilitarizers. Things that it's difficult to say to a mass audience because they may find it unpalatable can be said in metaphor. Do you really want your society to be this militarized? Do you really want it to have its gentility, its politeness shade over into menace? I don't think so. Because then you get nasty British with added Ku Klux Klan, which is what you get in Helsing. This can even be a metaphor for what happens if you do nothing, if you don't vote, if you don't engage, if you allow political deals and defense discussions to happen behind closed doors. So every week on Japanese TV and every week in manga, you can have a metaphor for the dangers of the route down which your society is going, just by dressing it up as dear old romantic Gothic Britain. You get a lot of mileage for your money out of that kind of metaphor. And of course, such shady dealings can lead to dreadful ends. And the metaphoric impact of the burning of London in Helsing didn't really strike Britain all that strongly, because London itself has only had one serious fire in its history, if you don't count the Blitz, which we don't, because that wasn't an accidental fire. That was a load of Nazis dropping bombs. And hey, you know, we survived it. London's been burnt before. The 1666 one was really serious. That nearly took the city down. The Blitz was nothing. So for us, burning is something that hasn't happened often in London. But for Japan, of course, the image of the capital city in flames is far more terrifying. If any of you saw Roland Keltz's presentation on Apocalyptic Japan, you probably saw him make reference to that. The countless historic Tokyo fires called the Flowers of Edo, the fire bombings of the Pacific War that took Tokyo out, showing Japan a capital city in flames is a metaphor that hits them in the gut. It's truly, truly terrifying. King of Thorn, another show that uses Britain as a metaphor. It's ostensibly set on an island off the British coast, which looks suitably wild and remote, but to be fair, that island could be anywhere with bad weather and no decent beaches. You know, it doesn't have to be Britain. And what this show is essentially a locked room premise. It's what made Alien so tense and so successful as a movie. But it's also a take on Sleeping Beauty, and it's also a metaphor for a closed society. And as you all know, Japan has been in the process for the last 15, 20 years or so of debating its attitude to immigration, its attitude to the integration of foreigners, its attitude to the opening up of Japan, not just to people who come to visit, but to foreigners who want to make their residence there and be part of Japanese society. King of Thorn basically has a story in which a virus is attacking the whole of humanity, and 160 random survivors are allegedly assessed for the potential of their DNA and then put into cryosleep to escape the virus. They're supposed to be wakened in 100 years, when either it will have burned itself out or they will have found a cure. But in fact, 4 survivors, 4 of 160, wake 48 hours later and find that a facility that was supposed to protect them is a haunt of monsters trying to destroy them. Now, as metaphors for not putting faith in technology go, it's a beauty, but as metaphors for how you deal with alien or viral incursions into the body of the state, it's perhaps a slightly less welcoming one that we might hope for. And as with Helsing, right through King of Thorns, we see nods to a kind of fossilized Britishness in the imagery, the interiors, fragments of the design, but they're really just labels stuck onto the story to signify wildness and otherness, and that this is absolutely not happening in Japan. And so we can ask some really dangerous questions about how we regard foreign, alien, invasion, incursion, infection, about how we look at things other than ourselves. And so the metaphor works beautifully. It's not a bad series. And of course, Emma, beautiful manga and anime, Emma, Victorian Romance, it explores Britain's attitude to class, race, and money in the Victorian era. And of course, that couldn't have any implications for modern-day Japan at all, could it? Because it's not Britain and it's not Victorian. So, for example, modern Japan, being a country like modern Britain, doesn't have inequality in social and educational purposes. Workers don't toil in mills and factories for impossibly long hours until they die of overwork. So this is obviously not a look at Japan, but a metaphor. And it's actually one of the most beautifully researched metaphors that you'll ever see. I have such respect for Mori Sensei because the research is spot on and the devotion to getting the detail of Victorian England right is fantastic. And of course, in Victorian England, a young woman could become involved from a man from a different race or from a much superior class to her own. And that can happen in Victorian England, and that's quite safe because we're not talking about Japan. We're just talking about a beautiful old historical love story about a maid being swept off her feet by a dusky prince from a foreign culture. Ain't gonna happen at home, so you can enjoy it safely. Look at Steam Boy. Look back to the golden age of British industrial inventiveness, before we sold off most of our great industries and gave global megacorporations greater and greater influence on our infrastructure. Britain was really something. And Steam Boy is a massive celebration of the rural Britannia age of steam, the steampunk empire that never was but really should have been. Look at the joyous creative energy in the way the steam age is depicted, and the way it's linked with images of prosperity, social stability, progress. But then outside influences and family tensions admit outsiders whose only interests are their own and who obviously bring in wicked and perverse versions of the fabulous technology of steam to enable them to take over power. I mean, just look at that manga page and the anime page next to it. The inventiveness, the joyousness, the reveling in technology and industry. And it's not only the grander parts of town that are beautifully and elegantly portrayed. Even if you get to the humblest areas, the little back streets where the workers live, you can see them illuminated by the light of science. And the underlying metaphor of all this is a really interesting one to work through, again, if we're thinking about present day or this century Japan, because it emphasizes the importance of scientific autonomy. Yes, work together for the common good. Yes, create things that do the world good, but don't sell out your national patrimony of technical expertise and technical inventiveness to faceless global megacorporations who will not keep will not keep Britain great. Be careful who you hand your tech to. And again, as a metaphor, I think that's a very powerful and very interesting way to take it. Now, mashup is really at the fun end of using another country. A mashup is how I describe a way of paying homage to an artifact or a culture you really love. It's inserting yourself and your vision into something that inspired and amazed you. So if I were to make my own version of Forrest Gump, I would be older than I was at the time, old enough to join in, right there in the front row of the Cavern Club, catching John Lennon's eye as the Beatles played. That would be my mashup. You see, mashups all over the place in anime and manga, and they have elements of metaphor, and in many ways, puzzles are also mashups, and particularly the puzzles I'm going to talk about later are mashups of one great English novel. But my personal favorite mashup in anime takes me back again to Hellsing. You remember I mentioned Jerry and Sylvia Anderson's show Thunderbirds? Well, this is a mashup from another of their shows. I don't know if anybody here knows their live-action science fiction show, UFO. Fabulous vision of the 60s, looking at the impossible future of the 80s and alien invasion of Britain. It starred a Canadian actor, Ed Bishop, now sadly deceased, as an American, Ed Straker, who took the idea of alien invasion seriously and set up a secret organization under a British film studio as humanity's one line of defense against organ-harvesting aliens from beyond the solar system, which is pretty damn serious stuff if it's your organs they're harvesting. There's an automatic connection with organ harvesting in Hellsing because, of course, what do vampires do if not harvest some of the most important bits of you in terms of your blood? But if you actually look at Hellsing, the point where it first hit me that UFO was a mashup of Hellsing was when I saw that scene of Integra looking in at an operating room where, frame by frame, it's a direct quote from the live-action sequence above it from UFO's opening episode Identified. I kid you not. You watch those two scenes, Hellsing quotes UFO Identified. But there were other clues to the fact that we were paying homage to UFO here. There's Integra Hellsing herself, Straker and Hellsing, both icy blondes who wear brown suits. They both put duty before everything else. They both exert iron control over their underlings. They're both highly intelligent. As well as those sharp suits, they both enjoy a cigar. They've both inherited their roles in the face of opposition from older members of their hierarchies. But although the anime character of Integra is very close to the character of Ed Straker in UFO, the manga Integra is much more playful, much more humorous, much more conventional, sexier. So I looked at the mashup and I thought there's another element in this mix, and it clicked when I thought about the Avengers. Not the Avengers that you guys have, the proper Avengers, the original. Mrs. Peel, Mrs. Emma Peel of the Avengers and John Steed of the Avengers could kick the butt of Tony Stark and his cohorts any day, any day. And I think Integra Fairbrook Wingate's Hellsing is the love child of Ed Straker and Mrs. Emma Peel. Because Mrs. Peel is all those things that the manga Integra is. She's playful, she's unconventional, she's sexy, she wears fantastic skin-tight leather clothing. All right, that's a variation. But this is the fun of mashups. Popular culture is a universal ocean, and we can all dip into each other's cultures and take what we like best from them. Someday, I will have a chance to talk to Hirano-sensei, and I'm going to ask, so what is this thing about UFO? What is this thing about the Avengers? And find out if I'm right. But when you're reading Japanese popular culture, and you see something that you think reminds you of something in American, British, French culture, you are probably right, because the Japanese have a very wide cultural frame of reference, and they cheerfully borrow and use whatever they need to. Another mashup you might know about that I mentioned earlier comes in Hayao Miyazaki's movie Princess Mononoke. I contributed to that British book of essays by scholars on Mononoke earlier in the year. And one of the things that I talk about in my chapter is the uncanny parallels between the story of the movie and a book by an author that Miyazaki has said he admires, the English author Rosemary Sutcliffe. He mashes Sutcliffe's love story of Roman Scotland into early medieval Japan. And if you read The Mark of the Horse Lord, which Japan read as Ono Shirashi, the Seal of the King, you see that the two stories track each other almost line for line and character for character. It's extremely interesting. I've got a presentation on that too. Maybe they'll let me do that next year. But let's look at puzzles. Britain is often a puzzle to Japan. They don't, for example, understand why we put milk or lemon in our tea. They think it totally destroys the flavor. And yet, one of the British puzzles that endlessly fascinates Japan is, of course, our greatest living detective. And our greatest living detective is the man who never lived and will never die, as a British play calls him, the mighty Sherlock Holmes. Created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Holmes has been recreated many times in many forms around the world, and Japan is among the most inventive adapters of Holmes. If any of you have the chance to see Jet's manga, I urge you to take that opportunity. Jet is an author who came from the doujin community. She, in fact, many years ago in the 80s, used to do a doujin with Sherlock as a vampire and Watson as a werewolf. Friend of mine has everything she did, and it's fantastic. But these ones are straight renditions of Doyle's stories for a straight publisher. Sherlock Holmes no Boken, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And she does five stories which come directly from Holmes stories. Asahi Sonorama did them in 2006. There was a reprint in 2009. They are, like Kaoru Mori, Jet recreates Victorian London with great love and fantastic detail. Sadly, I have to say, not everybody in Japan is so respectful of the detail, but we still come out with some great stuff. This is probably most people's favorite Japanese mashup of Holmes, Meitante Holmes. It's certainly the favorite of most British people. Worked on by Hayao Miyazaki, a joint project between Tokyo Movie Shinsha and the Italian State Broadcasting Corporation, RAI. 6 episodes by Miyazaki in 81, and then they hit a problem. They hadn't actually cleared everything with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's estate, thinking that it was out of copyright, because in Japan, the term of copyright is only 50 years. But Conan Doyle's family, who manage his estate, were trying to argue that because new Sherlock Holmes material had been put out by the estate, not by Conan Doyle, the stories might not have been in copyright, but the character was still in copyright. So while the lawyers talked over that issue, a suspension in production had to be made, and Miyazaki moved on to other projects. By the time the issue was resolved in 1983, a new director had to come on board to do the remaining episodes, and the show was finally aired in 1984. Hugely, hugely popular, and still one of Britain's favourite versions of our own Sherlock. However, there are dog versions of Sherlock Holmes that are much less dignified. And this is Yuma Ando and Yuki Saito's manga, Tanteiken Sherdok. Sherdok for Sherlock Dog. This is a cute dog in an impossibly silly cosplay hat who communicates his great detective adventures to his owner and his owner's girlfriend. And it has a certain weird and perverted charm, but it's not the Sherlock Holmes you're looking for. You can go about your business. This is slightly more the Sherlock Holmes you're looking for, and this was an attempt to update Sherlock. And it's interesting because, again, from Asahi, we did the Jet manga, straight classic rendition, but this makes Sherlock Holmes and Watson 2 teenagers, and it's trying to bring in a younger market for the Sherlock adventures. And of course, it's foreshadowing the great updating of Sherlock, which will come later. But we've also had Sherlock as a guy with a family. Excuse me. Because there's long been a tradition of presenting a fictional niece of Sherlock Holmes in anime and manga to give you the opportunity to do shoujo Sherlock, if you will. And this is Christie, Sherlock Holmes's sister's daughter, in London Massive, which of course is a great phrase to throw around for a youth culture audience, talking to her uncle and to his friend Dr. Watson and solving all sorts of issues. The great Kora Shintani of Area 88, once again, spot on with those big-eyed characters and just creating a wonderful, wonderful mashup and puzzle. But of course, once Sherlock came out from the BBC with Benedict Cumberbatch's impossible cheekbones and those otter eyes. Actually, Benedict Cumberbatch's mum used to be in the series UFO. I don't know if any of you know that, but she was a very popular British TV actress, Wanda Ventham, extremely beautiful woman, and she gave him those cheekbones and those eyes. And on her, they look superb. So I reckon the oddity of his face comes from his dad. Sorry, Mr. Cumberbatch, but that's happened. But Jay, another Dojin artist, got to do Kadokawa's manga in 2012, which, of course, freely adapts Holmes's stories in modern Britain, and is one of the most stunning manga I've ever seen. That cover is the portrait that Benedict Cumberbatch has in his attic to freeze him at that level forever. One of the most beautiful manga covers I've ever seen. And of course, there is dear Mark Gatiss, the British actor who writes Sherlock, playing his brother Mycroft. So what we have here is Japan responding to a series of puzzles by rendering them straight the British way, rendering them straight the Japanese way, rendering them warped into cute dogs and perhaps slightly less cute dogs, rendering them as very young preteens, and finally rendering them as Sherlock for a modern age. And looking at Britain through that puzzle, looking at Britain through the lens of its great detective, has helped a lot of Japanese people to configure how they think about Britain, and therefore a little more how they think about themselves. And at Comic-Con 94, last weekend in Tokyo, a Dojin mashup of Leiji Matsumoto's iconic Captain Harlock and BBC's worldwide hit series Sherlock, Captain Sherlock, starring obviously Phantom F. Cumberbatch. I love that cover. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I've got a friend, a Dutch friend, who's promised to bring me back a copy, so I'm really looking forward to seeing that. But you see, the whole of Sherlock Holmes in popular culture, the whole of so many British characters in popular culture, have been appropriated by Japanese artists, and I say that in the best and most joyous way. They're being used, being given whole new leases of life, and being spun in the direction that Japan wants to take them. And actually, if Conan Doyle was right, he was a spiritualist. He believed in life beyond the grave. And I believe that somewhere in the afterlife that he believed in, he's sitting there getting all this downloaded on the spiritualist equivalent of YouTube. And he is just loving every second of it. But Britain's most enjoyable function in anime is as a playground. Japanese people love coming to Europe, and Britain is one of their favorite playgrounds. And it's somewhere that the creative teams of a Japanese animation studio can indulge themselves. Picture the scene. You're sitting in your studio and you're drawing something for your latest, greatest, most wonderful TV hit, and you're saying, hey boss, wouldn't it be a really good idea for that movie you wanted to do, we take the team to London? Of course, it means that a few of us will have to go to London first and do some research, but it won't cost a lot, honest, and we'll get so much good photographic material, it will save so much time on the movie. Creative teams want to let their imagination run riot on a fantasy island that they can actually go and visit. I give you K-On! The movie. Kyoto Animation really let rip on this. It's their cool Britannia extravaganza. They sent a team to London, they photographed, they drew, they researched. I'm sure they hung out in a number of interesting destinations that weren't strictly connected with the movie script, because that's what you do when you go to London. But let's have a look at the poster without all that lettering. Sadly, when we strip the lettering, we also strip the London bus that they've just nudged in by the side, so that you're absolutely sure that people are in London. Look at that as a frame. Now that is a scene that if you've been to London or if you've browsed books on London, you would think, hang on, I know that. That's the spire of St. Martin's in the Fields Church, except it isn't quite. It's been varied a little bit, and those buildings there are the ones on the corner of St. Martin's Lane, running down to the National Gallery, except they're not quite. What they've done is they've taken a whole series of vistas of London and reconstructed a London that suits their story. so that their viewers don't have to miss a second of the atmosphere they expect because of the inconvenience of London's physical geography. Because you know, guys, like Tokyo, like Dallas, we're a fair-sized city. You have to go quite a long way sometimes to see all the iconic sites you want. It's only on tourist postcards that have been photoshopped that you can see the Tower of London and the Houses of Parliament and the Shard and the London Eye and Covent Garden all lined up within line of sight. So K-On! The movie does that. And it also does some of those little anachronisms that we were talking about earlier. British policemen haven't actually worn uniforms like that since about 1954. But an awful lot of old movies and old books that are around in Japan will show British policemen wearing things like that. So, of course, you ignore the current modern uniforms, which are not nearly as iconic and not nearly as British, even though they work much better and are more utilitarian, and you find a proper British bobby of a type that hasn't been seen on the streets of London since the mid-1950s, and you put him back there for the girls of K-On! To have their picture taken with. Incidentally, that's a really beautiful doorway, an excellent background, and you can actually photograph doorways and ironwork exactly like that almost all over London. It's just that they don't have 1954 bobbies standing in front of them. But hey, when you're going to animate it, you just draw him in the same way you do the girls. Now, this is a really interesting set of slides. They go everywhere on the underground, even though you will never see even a struggling youth band taking all its instruments on the underground because it's so crowded and it's so difficult, and you really don't want to be hauling basses and big guitar cases around with you on a crowded train. So what they've done is simply cited them at times when the trains aren't crowded, but those are completely accurate representations of the London Underground stations in question. I have sat in that alcove on Aldgate East Station. I'm amazed that it's not crowded with K-On! Fans also sitting there and saying, quick, just take the four of us. No, wait, let me get my guitar case in position. Camden Town Station looks exactly like that. So this is real love and real homage, and not just a crew having fun, but a crew allowing their characters to have fun somewhere that they've been lucky enough to visit and that they know that all the kids watching the movie would love to visit. And when you get to the ultimate, a concert in Parliament Square, you can only have it in anime. We can't have that in Britain. Why? Because with the current terrorist situation, Parliament Square is full of concrete barricades and policemen not looking reassuring the 1950s and armed with AK-47s. If you tried to take out a guitar case in Parliament Square at the moment, you would be on the floor with a gun behind your head so fast your feet wouldn't touch the ground. And whether or not you were a cute Japanese schoolgirl would make no difference whatsoever. So in a way, the dream of London that K-On! The movie presents is actually better than the reality of London that you would have to face if you went to Parliament Square and thought, what are all these people hanging out with guns in this romantic setting where I ought to be hearing the Kinks singing Waterloo Sunset as they look beyond Big Ben across the river? That's the London we all want. That's the London Londoners want. We'd much rather not have terrorists and concrete barriers, actually. We think cute Japanese girl bands are a better idea. But that's the London that in the reality of the modern world we can't have. But anime and manga and fiction can give us that London. And that London, to me, is one of Japan's great gifts to me. The way Japan perceives my country, my town, has taught me as much about it as it's taught the Japanese about Japan and about themselves. So, to me, the whole use of Britain to Japan is that we enable Japan to look at itself in a safe space, and the whole use of Japan to Britain is that it shows me my country in ways that I hadn't quite conceived. It shows me the beauty of my country, the oddity of my country, the weirdness of my country, and also the wonderful endurance, flexibility, and pride in my country. And for that, I shall always be in Japan's debt. And I hope that perhaps Japan is a little in Britain's debt for giving them a safe space to contemplate what actually happens on small islands with ancient monarchies and tea ceremonies. Thank you very much for that. These are the rest of my sessions at AnimeFest, and I hope you'll come and see them. And before I ask you for questions, I've got one message for you. On behalf of everyone who speaks at conventions, if you have enjoyed a panel, tell the convention programming team, I really liked that, I'd like to see more. If something is missing that you haven't enjoyed, somebody said to me earlier today, would you do a panel on Satoshi Kon? Heck, I'd do a panel on Satoshi Kon in a heartbeat. So if you want a panel on Satoshi Kon or any other creator or any other topic, contact the convention team and say, hey, I'd really like to see a panel on this. If enough of you do it, it'll show up on next year's schedules because it's your membership fees that enable this convention to happen. And if you like me, and I sincerely hope you do, but I'm too British to ask you to say so right now in public, tell the convention that's a really cool woman, you need to get her back again next year. And anyway, she told us about 2 presentations she didn't do that we want to see her doing. So, thank you so much. Questions? There's a microphone.
Hi, just curious, what started all of this for you? Was there something you saw, something you read, learned about that just led to all
what
this
started?
research?
Yeah, the question is what started all of this for me. Anime and manga generally.
Yes.
In 1981, before many of this audience, but not all of this audience, were born, I met a guy, really cute, so hot I'm still with him. And he just got back on his graduation trip from Mallorca, which is an offshore island in Spain. And in Spain and Italy, they've had anime on TV and manga in translation since the early 1970s. So one night when he was on his trip, he saw a giant robot marathon. And as an art student, he was blown away by it. And he came home with a whole pile of stuff. And when we got together not long after, he told me, there's this really cool animation and comics, and I got them in Spain, but they actually come from Japan. I don't know much about them, and you work in a library. Do you think we could maybe look around? I worked at the time in Britain's National Library, so I had the best research facilities in the world. And there were no books in English on anime and manga. So I thought, I've got to write one. And that was where this started. That was, as I say, 1981, so quite a few years ago. 13 books in 8 languages later. I am still uncovering things. Anime and manga are endlessly fascinating, and it's been such a privilege to go on this journey, but essentially, it started with meeting a cute guy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so, yes. Okay, so you did mention that a lot of times Japan would use Britain as like almost a mirror for itself as well. What do you say would be an idea for Japan to further explore their concept of karoshi? It's a term used for death
from overwork, yes.
So would something like the industrial age of Britain be a good example for karoshi for the adults of Japan by using images of children in the factories? Would that be a good example?
Actually, I think something that might be profitable for Japan to look at, and indeed for America to look at, rather than looking at Britain in terms of karoshi, death from overwork, is to look at countries like India, where women haul 80 and 90-pound blocks of stone because they can't get any other work for the equivalent of about 50 cents a day, and where small children, like children as young as 8 or 9, work in clothing factories. I think that's something that we could all profitably look at. The clothes that most of us are wearing are made in China, because almost everything in the world is, but a lot of stuff is made in India, and I think we should all take really seriously our own responsibility for kids working in sweatshops, because by demanding lower and lower prices and more clothing, we are responsible for kids working in sweatshops, no escaping. But the question of karoshi is really interesting, because I don't know how many of you have picked up the book Toshio Suzuki brought out a few weeks ago. 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think, Suzuki brought out a book in Japanese and English, and Roland Keltz and I were talking about it earlier today. And in the book, he mentions talking about a conversation with a number of former Ghibli employees. He doesn't identify the one concerned, but apparently in the course of this conversation, someone piped up that they think that Takahata was responsible for working Hirofumi Kondo to death through karoshi. Now, that's totally uncollaborated, and Suzuki just throws it in there in the conversation. It's the kind of thing that gets headlines and sells books, and Suzuki is really good at selling books. But there is still that perception that people want to work so much in industries like anime and manga that they can be exploited by studio heads, by directors, by editors, who will just keep them working till they drop. I think what we all have to realize is that however great our duty to our family, our country, and our employer, our first duty is to stay alive. And we can all help that as fans by keeping feeding back to creators. I love what you're doing. I want to buy lots more of your work in time to come. Please look after yourself. Please stay alive. Sometimes creators are taken from us in ways that we can't affect, like Satoshi Kon, who had a diagnosis for pancreatic cancer and was dead less than 6 months later. We can't avoid that, but we can all encourage the creators we love to look after themselves as much as they can. And of course, we can make that easier for them by elephant in the room again. We can buy their work and not pirate it, so they don't have to work even harder to make up the money. Yeah, I know. It's really hard, but it is the truth. Great question, thank you. One more before I go, anyone? Anyone? No? Well, thank you for being a fantastic audience. Please come and see me tomorrow if you want to get published, or on Monday talking about the women who were responsible for modern anime and manga. And please enjoy the rest of the con. Thank you very much.